Old man, I need you to take your cart and your mop and find somewhere else to be. We are running a classified training exercise in this building, and you are in the way. The voice came from the end of the corridor with the flat, carrying authority of someone accustomed to instant compliance. The voice of a man who has given orders in environments where hesitation was a form of death and has never entirely adjusted it back down to peacetime volume. Lieutenant Commander Rafe Desjardins stood at the junction of corridors B and C in the Naval Special Warfare Command Training Complex at Little Creek, Virginia, in full tactical kit, plate carrier, helmet, NVGs raised, the particular organized weight of a man rigged for a deliberate purpose. He was 34 years old, 12 years in the teams, with 2 silver stars and a Distinguished Service Medal, and the compact, dangerous stillness of someone who had been made into a very specific kind of instrument, and knew it. The old man with the mop did not move. He was at the far end of the corridor, working with the patient, methodical rhythm of someone for whom thoroughness was a personal matter rather than a job requirement. His name was Harold Vincent Tatum, and he was 80 years old. He wore the gray uniform of the facility's contracted cleaning staff, plain trousers, a work shirt with a small embroidered patch on the breast pocket, and a pair of rubber-soled shoes that made no sound on the linoleum. He was a slight man, lean in the way of people who have never carried extra weight in their lives, with white hair cropped close and a face deeply seamed by decades of weather and whatever else the decades had brought. His hands on the mop handle were ropey and spotted and entirely without tremor. He did not look up. Sir Desjardins moved down the corridor, his 4-man element fanning behind him with the automatic geometry of trained men in a known space. I need this corridor clear. This is a timed exercise, and you are breaking the integrity of the operational environment. I need you to move your cart to the supply room, and I need you to do it now. Harold Tatum wrung out the mop with the practiced efficiency of one motion, set it in the bucket, and looked up. His eyes were gray, not the gray of age, or not only that, but the gray of deep water with light at the surface and no visible bottom below it. They were the eyes of a man who had looked at things for a very long time and had arrived at a settled relationship with what he had seen. A relationship that had nothing to do with approval or disapproval, and everything to do with understanding. They moved across Desjardins with the same unhurried attention he gave the floor, observing, cataloging, complete. The exercise breached its sector 4:14 minutes ago, Harold Tatum said. Desjardins stopped. His element stopped behind him. Excuse me? Your opposing force. Harold Tatum's voice was low and level, the kind of voice that does not waste energy on volume, because it has learned that the words carry more weight when the delivery does not. They came in through the SVAC access on the east wall of the server room 14 minutes ago. They've been in position on the 3rd floor since 13 minutes ago. You're running your entry pattern on the 2nd floor, which means you've been underneath them for 11 minutes. He reached for the mop again. You'll want to know that before you make entry. Desjardins stared at him. The corridor smelled of cleaning solution and old concrete, and somewhere in the ductwork above them a fan cycled on with a mechanical sigh, and for 3 full seconds nobody said anything. How do you know that? Desjardins said. It was not phrased as a question. I've been here since 043DO, Harold Tatum said. I know where the access points are. He began mopping again. The entry team lead on 3 is set up in the northeast corner of the server room alcove. He's using the junction box housing for cover. It's not adequate cover. The housing is 18-gauge steel, not rated for anything, but he doesn't know that. You do now. Desjardins looked at his element lead. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb, who looked back at him with the expression of a man recalibrating rapidly. "Old man," Desjardins said, and his voice had shifted. Not softer, exactly, but aimed differently. The way a beam changes when the reflective surface moves. "Who are you?" Harold Tatum did not answer. He wrung out the mop. "Hey," one of the junior SEALs, Petty Officer Third Class Garrett Nolan, 24 years old, 7 months past Bud-esque graduation, stepped forward with the particular energy of someone who has not yet learned the difference between aggression and confidence. He moved to the mop cart and put his hand on it. "The LT asked you a question. And you need to move this cart." He leaned in slightly. "What is your name, and what is your clearance level? Because you should not have been anywhere near this exercise corridor, and I want to know." Harold Tatum looked at the hand on his cart. Then he looked at Nolan. "Take your hand off my equipment, son." The words were quiet. They were not a request, and they were not a threat. They were a statement about the nature of reality delivered in the way that a compass points, without argument, without urgency, in the direction that things simply are. Nolan removed his hand. He was not entirely sure why. He would think about it later. Desjardins stepped forward and put 2 fingers on the edge of the mop cart, not gripping it, not threatening, but using the touch as a punctuation mark, a physical signal that the conversation had not concluded on the old man's terms. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his voice dropping to the register he used when he wanted someone to understand that what was being said once. "We have been running this counterterrorism exercise for 8 hours. My team has been awake for 22 hours. We have failed this scenario twice. This is not a game. This is how men train to not die, and you are." He stopped. Steadied. "You are a civilian contractor in a gray work shirt with a mop, and you are inside a secured training environment, and if you have actually been observing this exercise without authorization, that is a serious problem that I am going to address as soon as we are done here. But right now I am asking you, one more time. The 4th attempt will fail the same way the first 3 did." Desjardins' jaw tightened. The scenario designers built in an asymmetric entry point on the east side, Harold Tatum continued. His mop resumed its quiet circuit. "They always do. It's the variance they put in to break pattern-dependent teams. Your team is pattern-dependent. You run a modified Mogadishu Mile approach on every entry. Left breach, right support. Stagger 3 and 4 to rear security. It's disciplined. It's also predictable, and this scenario was built to punish predictable." He paused. "The solution is a diagonal primary entry off the northeast stairwell, with your 2 and 3 swapped to support. It puts your element lead in a direct line on the server room alcove before the opposing team can reorient. You'll have 4 seconds of exposure on the approach. That's acceptable." The corridor was very quiet. Marcus Webb was looking at the old man with an expression that had traveled a long distance from where it had started. "Sir," he said to Desjardins, quietly, "he's not wrong about the asymmetric entry. I flagged it in the brief, and it got cut." Desjardins said nothing for a moment. Then, "How do you know what our approach pattern is?" Harold Tatum wrung out the mop for the last time, set it in the bucket, and turned to face Desjardins fully for the first time. He was not a tall man, and age had taken something from his stature, but there was a quality to the way he occupied the corridor, a complete, grounded, entirely unhurried quality that made the space feel arranged around him rather than around the man in the plate carrier and the helmet. "I've watched you run it 3 times tonight," he said. The corridor cameras don't cover the northeast stairwell. That's your entry point. You already know this. You just haven't committed to it yet because it violates your doctrine. He picked up the handle of the cart and turned it toward the supply room doorway. You will pass this exercise, or you will not. That is not my business. He began to move the cart. Good luck, Lieutenant Commander. Petty Officer 3rd Class Garrett Nolan watched him go. Something about the way the old man moved, the economy of it, the absence of any wasted motion, the quality of absolute self-containment was pulling at the part of Nolan's brain that had been trained to notice things. He had grown up in Anniston, Alabama, and his uncle had been a Marine and had told him once that the most dangerous men he had ever encountered were not the loudest ones in the room. He was thinking about that now. He thought about it hard enough that when Desjardins said, "Quietly, Element, fall back to the brief room," Nolan stayed a half step behind the rest of the team and looked down at the corridor floor where the old man had been mopping. The floor was clean. Completely clean. Not damp clean the way a mopped floor looks when it has been gone over once. Genuinely, thoroughly clean in a way that spoke to someone who had been working this corridor for several hours with the patient. Complete attention of a man who could not do a thing halfway. And beside the supply room doorway, just inside where the cart had been parked, Nolan noticed something he had not noticed before. A small folded piece of paper tucked beneath the cart's lower shelf. He picked it up. It was a hand-drawn floor plan of the 2nd and 3rd floors of the training complex. The HESVAC access points were marked. The camera blind spots were marked. The junction box location on the 3rd floor was marked with a small circle and the annotation, 18 Geo, no cover. The northeast stairwell approach was marked with a dotted line and an arrow. Nolan stood holding it for 3 seconds. Then he went to find his LT. In the facility security office, a retired Master Chief named Gerald Oates, who served as the civilian training coordinator, was sitting across a desk from the phone he was using to run the exercise's opposing force communication when the door opened and Lieutenant Commander Desjardins walked in with the hand-drawn floor plan. Oates looked at the paper. He looked at Desjardins. He said, "Where did you get that?" "An old man with a mop," Desjardins said. "Name's Harold Tatum. What can you tell me about him?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a man doing several calculations simultaneously and arriving at a result he had not expected. Gerald Oates set down the phone. "Say the name again." "Harold Vincent Tatum." Oates was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then he stood up with the deliberate, considered motion of a man standing up, because the situation requires him to be on his feet. And he picked up the desk phone, and he dialed a number from memory, and when the line connected, he said only, "This is Oates at Little Creek. I need you to find Admiral Sheridan, and I need you to tell him that Harold Tatum is in Building 7. "Yes, I'll hold." He held for 90 seconds. When the voice came back, it was not the aide's voice. It was a different voice, tighter, with the controlled urgency of someone who has just come out of a chair faster than they intended to. Oates said, "Yes, sir. Building 7. Main corridor. Sir, he's mopping the floors." "Yes, sir, I understand. We'll hold him here." He hung up. He looked at Descharnes with an expression that was not quite awe, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of the recent past. "Son," he said, "you are going to want to sit down and wait for about 15 minutes, because what is coming through that door is going to require some adjustment on your part." Desjardins did not sit. He stood in the security office with his plate carrier and his helmet and his 22 hours without sleep, and tried to construct a framework for what was happening. and found that none of the frameworks he had were adequate. In the Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters building 4 miles away, Vice Admiral Thomas Sheridan was not in his chair. He had not been in his chair since the aide's second word. He was in the corridor outside his office with his cover on and his aide moving fast behind him, and he was speaking in the crisp, minimal way of a man whose processing has shifted entirely to output. 2 vehicles, dress uniforms, Building 7 at Little Creek. Now, his aide was already on the radio. 3 floors up, in the Joint Operations Center where the current year's senior NSDO leadership was assembled for a readiness assessment, a captain named Birch had just answered a phone and was standing very still with the receiver at his ear. The other 7 officers in the room were watching him. He hung up. He looked at the room. He said, "Admiral Sheridan is en route to Building 7. Harold Tatum is in the building." He paused. "If you don't know that name, you should. If you do, you understand why we're going." He was moving before the sentence finished. All 8 officers followed. In Building 7's main corridor, Harold Vincent Tatum had returned from the supply room with an empty bucket and was refilling it at the utility sink at the corridor's end. He worked with the same unhurried thoroughness he had brought to everything that night, checking the water temperature, measuring the cleaning solution with the automatic precision of someone who has done this 10,000 times and has opinions about the ratio. The exercise had resumed somewhere above him, the distant sound of controlled movement on the 3rd floor audible through the ceiling if you knew what to listen for. He listened. He noted what he heard. He went back to filling the bucket. He did not hear the vehicles arrive. He heard the doors, though, the particular sharp sequence of multiple doors closing with intention, and then boots on the entrance floor. And then the quality of the corridor changing the way a corridor changes when the people filling it are filling it with purpose. Vice Admiral Thomas Sheridan walked through the fire door at the end of the corridor and saw Harold Tatum at the utility sink and stopped walking. The 7 officers behind him stopped. The 2 enlisted men in dress uniforms stopped. Everyone stopped. Sheridan walked forward alone. He was a broad-shouldered man of 58, silver-haired, with the face of someone who had been responsible for things he could not talk about, in places he could not name for 3 decades, and wore that responsibility the way good wood wears weather. It had shaped him, without diminishing him. He walked the length of the corridor in the particular silence of a man who understands the weight of what he is approaching. And he stopped in front of Harold Tatum, and looked at him the way you look at something you were not sure you would ever see again. Harold Tatum turned from the sink. Vice Admiral Thomas Sheridan brought his right hand up and snapped to the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute that Lieutenant Commander Rafe Desjardins had seen in 12 years of naval service. A salute that hit the brim of a vice admiral's cover like a blade finding its edge, held with absolute rigidity, directed at the 80-year-old man in the gray contractor's uniform, with the mop bucket at his feet. 1 second, 2, 3, behind Desjardins, Petty Officer Nolan made a sound that was small and entirely involuntary. Sheridan brought the salute down and extended his hand, and Harold Tatum took it, and the handshake was brief and complete and contained within it the entire unspoken history of men who have stood in the same dark, in the same kind of places. "Harold," Sheridan said. His voice had the quality of a man who has prepared something to say and finds, in the moment, that it is inadequate. "It's been a long time." 14 years, Harold Tatum said. Sheridan turned to face the assembled corridor, the officers, the enlisted men, Desjardins and his element who had drifted in from the brief room, Nolan with the floor plan still in his hand. Harold Vincent Tatum, Sheridan said, and the name in his voice had a weight that names acquire when they have been spoken in briefings and in histories and in the careful, permanent language of official records. United States Navy. Reported 1962. Underwater Demolition Team 12, then Naval Special Warfare Group 2 from its earliest designation. 4 combat deployments, 2 to Vietnam, 1 to Laos, which officially did not happen, and which I can mention now only because enough time has passed, and one I am still not in a position to name. He paused. He holds the record for the longest sustained surveillance operation in NUST history, a record that stood for 31 years before it was broken, and which was broken using a methodology that Harold developed and documented in a training manual that every operator in this command has read. Not a version of it. The original. His name is not on it because of the classification level. It should be. Desjardins was stone. He was awarded the Navy Cross for an action in 1968 that I am also not going to detail except to say that 4 men came home who would not have come home. And the margin by which they came home was Harold Tatum's willingness to be in a place that no rational assessment of the situation would have put him. He looked down the corridor toward the supply room, toward the mop and the bucket and the gray contractor's uniform, then back at his command. He has been mopping these floors on Tuesday and Thursday nights for 6 years. He asked us not to make it known. We have respected that. His eyes moved to Desjardins, the floor plan he gave your element tonight. That is not a lucky observation from an old man with time on his hands. That is 60 years of understanding how buildings become problems and how problems become solutions. He saw in 4 hours what your team missed in 8. He paused once more, and the pause was not for effect. I would encourage you to think about what that means. The silence in the corridor was the kind that does not ask to be filled. The formal record, Lieutenant Commander Desjardins received no disciplinary action. He did receive, through proper channels, a letter of instruction regarding the conduct of training environments that used language careful enough to be inarguable. Petty Officer 3rd Class Nolan received a commendation for situational awareness. The exercise was run a 4th time using the northeast stairwell approach, with the element 2 and 3 positions swapped as recommended. The team passed with a score that stood as the facility record for the next 2 years. Then Desjardins walked down the corridor to where Harold Tatum had gone back to his bucket. He moved without his plate carrier, without his helmet, without any of the equipment that made him what he was. He stopped beside the old man and stood for a moment, finding the words, which were harder to find than he had expected. He placed a hand on Harold Tatum's shoulder, gently, the way you place a hand on something when you want to convey that you understand you were wrong about what it was. I owe you an apology, he said. I told you that you were in the way. You weren't in the way. You were the only person in this building tonight who actually saw the problem. He paused. I don't know how you did what you did in this corridor in the dark, and I'm not sure I'm capable of it yet. But I'm going to spend the next 20 years trying to understand it. Harold Tatum looked at him with those deep water eyes. You already know how to see, he said. You've been trained to see. The part you haven't learned yet is to see what's there instead of what you expect. He picked up the mop. Your team is good. I watched them. They're disciplined, and they're fast, and they work together the way teams are supposed to work together. He paused. Just make sure the discipline doesn't become the wall that keeps the picture out. He set the mop in the water and looked at Desjardins once more. Get some sleep, Lieutenant Commander. You've been awake a long time. He turned and began the next section of the corridor. 6 weeks later, On a Saturday morning in October, Desjardins was buying groceries at a market on Shore Drive in Virginia Beach when he saw Harold Tatum at the end of an aisle, reading the label on a can of coffee, with the same careful attention he brought to everything. Desjardins looked at him for a moment. The gray work clothes replaced by a plain flannel shirt and dark trousers. The mop bucket traded for a shopping basket. The building with its corridors and its tactical weight reduced to a Saturday morning in a grocery store. He looked like any old man. He looked like nobody. He looked like someone you would walk past without a second thought. Desjardins walked over. Harold Tatum looked up before he arrived, a half-second before. With that quality of awareness that does not announce itself but is simply present, the way certain animals know the weather before it turns. "Lieutenant Commander," he said. "Just Rafe," Desjardins said. "If that's all right." Harold Tatum considered him for a moment. Then he set the can of coffee in his basket and reached past Desjardins to take another one from the shelf and held it out. "This one," he said. "The other has more filler." Desjardins took it. He stood there holding a can of coffee in a grocery store, looking at an 80-year-old man who had watched more carefully than he had, and said so quietly it hadn't felt like an indictment. And he thought, this is what it looks like when it has had 60 years to become what it is. "Thank you," he said, "for the coffee and for the other thing." Harold Tatum nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and turned back toward the next aisle. Desjardins watched him go. The slight figure in the flannel shirt moving through the ordinary Saturday morning of the grocery store, unhurried, complete, carrying everything he was without displaying any of it. The way the deepest water looks the most still. Some of them are still here, the ones who learned to see in the dark and came home and went on living as if the ordinary world were enough. Because for them it is. Because they earned it, and because they understand, in the way that only certain experiences can teach, that the ordinary world is not ordinary at all. It is the thing all of it was for. If you were moved by Harold's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.